is a bed in the White House that was never slept in. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. The sheets were pressed and clean. The pillow had never taken the shape of a man's head. The president who ordered that bed made up never got the chance to lie down in it. His name was William Henry Harrison. He was 68 years old. He was the oldest man ever elected president of the United States at that time. And 31 days after he took the oath of office, he was dead. That's the part everyone knows, or thinks they know. Here's what most people don't know. The official story says he caught a cold, stood out in the rain too long, gave a speech that lasted nearly 2 hours in freezing wind without a hat or a coat, went to bed with a cough, never got up again. Simple, sad, a little foolish maybe. The kind of story that gets written down in textbooks and then forgotten. But the men who were in that building with him, the men who watched him die, they told a different story in private. A quieter story. One that passed from mouth to mouth for generations before anyone thought to write it down. And when scientists finally ran the tests, more than 150 years later, what they found did not match the official story at all. So tonight, we're going to sit with that. We're going to walk through those 31 days slowly. We're going to look at the water, the doctors, the men who stood to gain the most from Harrison's death, and the strange, specific way his body failed him. We're going to ask the question that people have been whispering since 1841. Was William Henry Harrison poisoned? Not by a bullet, not by a knife, but slowly, quietly, in a way that looked like illness, in a way that gave the men around him time to arrange things just the way they wanted them. Now, this is a mystery. It has no clean ending. There is no villain standing in a courtroom with a confession in his hand. What there is instead is a pattern. A set of facts that line up in a way that makes you pause, that makes you tilt your head and look again at a story you thought you already understood. The White House in 1841 was not the gleaming building you picture now. It was older, darker. The walls held cold air like a stone cellar. The water that ran beneath Pennsylvania Avenue was not clean. The city of Washington itself was built on swampy ground, and the smell of it in summer could knock a man sideways. But this was March. The cold was still in the ground, and a new president had just moved in. Harrison arrived with a sense of purpose. He was a military man, a war hero, the kind of man who had slept in worse places than any room in any mansion. He was not afraid of the cold. He was not afraid of hard work. He walked to the market himself in the mornings, basket in hand, like any ordinary citizen. His staff had to jog to keep up with him. He was not a man who looked like he was about to die. And yet, within days of moving in, something changed. He grew tired, then feverish, then confused. The doctors came. They brought their remedies. And here is where the story gets complicated, because the remedies they brought were, by any modern measure, closer to poison than to medicine. Opium, castor oil, bloodletting, camphor, brandy. One after another, they gave him things that would make a healthy man sick, and they gave them to a man who was already failing. By the time April came, he was gone. His vice president, John Tyler, had already been waiting. Some say he had been waiting for a very long time. Tonight's story is about what happens when power changes hands in the dark, when the official record says one thing and the evidence says another. When a man dies in the most protected house in the country and nobody asks the right questions for a century and a half, William Henry Harrison never unpacked his bags. He never slept in that bed. And the mystery of why he died so fast, so completely, so conveniently, that mystery is still open. Let's start at the beginning. Washington City, they called it then. Not Washington, D.C., just Washington City. And in March of 1841, it was still a rough and unfinished place. The streets were mostly mud. The buildings were mostly wood. The grand marble dream that the founders had imagined was still more dream than stone. Picture it on a cold morning. The sky the color of old pewter. The Potomac River running dark and slow to the south, carrying chunks of ice along its edges like broken glass. The trees bare, the grass dead and brown and flat against the frozen ground. The air smelled like wood smoke and horse and river mud. It smelled like a city that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. The Capitol building stood at the top of its hill. Its dome was not finished yet. Workers had started on it, then stopped, then started again. Iron scaffolding wrapped around it like a cage. From a distance, it looked like something half-born, something still becoming, which, in a way, was true of the whole country. The streets between the Capitol and the White House were unpaved. Carriages rolled through them and left deep ruts. When it rained, those ruts filled with brown water. When it froze, the water turned to ice, and the ruts became ridges, and the whole road turned treacherous. That morning, March 4th, 1841, it was cold enough to see your breath, cold enough to make your ears ache, cold enough that most sensible people would have stayed inside. William Henry Harrison did not stay inside. He rode to his inauguration on horseback. No hat, no overcoat. He was 68 years old, the oldest man ever to take that office at that time, and he wanted to show the crowd he was strong. He wanted to show them he was vigorous. He wanted to show them he was not too old for this. So he sat up straight in the saddle and let the wind cut through him like a knife through paper. The crowd gathered along Pennsylvania Avenue. Men in tall beaver hats and dark wool coats. Women in heavy skirts and bonnets tied tight against the cold. Children pressed between the legs of adults, trying to see. Everyone's cheeks were red. Everyone's breath came out in little white clouds. The whole scene looked like something painted on a tin plate, all muted colors and sharp winter light. Harrison climbed the steps of the Capitol. He stood at the podium, and then he began to speak. He spoke for 1 hour and 45 minutes. Some accounts say nearly 2 hours. He had written the speech himself, and he was proud of it. It was long and full of references to ancient Rome. It compared the American Republic to the Roman Republic. It quoted classical writers. It wound through history like a river through flat country, slow and wide, and in no particular hurry to arrive anywhere. Daniel Webster had looked at the speech beforehand. Webster was one of the most famous men in America at that time. A senator, a lawyer, a man whose voice could fill a room the way a church organ fills a cathedral. He had tried to trim the speech down. He later joked that he had killed 17 Roman consuls. And still, the speech went on and on. The crowd stood in the cold and listened, or tried to listen. The wind carried some of the words away before they could reach the back of the crowd. People shifted their weight from foot to foot. Children grew restless. Old men pulled their coats tighter. Harrison stood at that podium without a hat, without a coat, for nearly 2 hours. The cold settled into him the way cold settles into old wood. Slow and deep and hard to get out. The wind off the Potomac was the kind of wind that finds the gaps in your clothing and works its way through. The kind of wind that makes your joints ache the next morning. When the speech finally ended, there were celebrations, parties and dinners, and the kind of noise a city makes when it is happy. Harrison moved through all of it. He shook hands, he smiled. He was the president now. He had worked decades for this moment. He had earned it. But that night, when the fires burned low and the city went quiet, the cold was still in him, sitting somewhere behind his ribs, settled into his lungs like a tenant who had no intention of leaving. Nobody thought much of it. It was just a cold day. It was just a long speech. These things happen. Men get chilled and they recover. Most of them do. William Henry Harrison was not a small man. He stood just under 6 feet tall, which was considerable for his time. He had a long, angular face, sharp cheekbones, and pale blue eyes that people said could hold your gaze for an uncomfortable amount of time. His hands were large and calloused, not the hands of a politician, the hands of a man who had spent real time outdoors, in real weather, doing real work. He was born in 1773 on a Virginia plantation called Berkeley. The house still stands today. It sits on a bluff above the James River, surrounded by old oak trees and the kind of quiet that feels earned. His father, Benjamin Harrison, signed the Declaration of Independence. So William grew up in a house where history was not something distant. It was something that happened at the dinner table. He was supposed to become a doctor. His family sent him to study medicine in Philadelphia when he was 18. But his father died that same year. The money dried up, and Harrison, young and restless, and looking for something to do with his hands, joined the army instead. That decision shaped everything that came after. He spent years on the frontier. Real frontier. The kind with no roads and no maps and no guarantee you'd come back. He fought in the Northwest Territory, which is now Ohio and Indiana. He learned to read rivers and tree lines. He learned to sleep in the cold. He learned what it felt like to be afraid and keep moving anyway. Those years left a mark on him that no amount of fine clothes or political dinners could fully cover. By the time he was 30, he was the governor of Indiana Territory. He was responsible for an enormous stretch of land and the complicated, often violent negotiations that came with it. He was not a man who sat behind a desk. He rode out to meet people. He shook hands. He looked men in the eye. He made promises, and more often than most politicians, he tried to keep them. He married Anna Tuthill Sims in 1795. She was 22. He was 22. Her father did not approve. He thought Harrison had no money and no future. Anna married him anyway. They would go on to have 10 children together, which tells you something about the life they built. Anna was a quiet, steady woman. She managed the household at North Bend, Ohio, with the kind of calm efficiency that keeps a large family from falling apart. She was supposed to travel to Washington with her husband after the inauguration. She was sick that winter. She stayed home. She never saw him again. That detail sits heavy if you let it. Harrison was 68 years old when he took office. The oldest man to become president up to that point. His opponents had spent the entire campaign suggesting he was too old, too slow, too far past his prime. So Harrison decided to prove them wrong. He would give the longest inaugural address in American history. He would stand outside in the cold without a hat or a coat. He would show the country that he was still the man who had slept on frozen ground and won. It was a kind of pride, the stubborn, physical kind, the kind that makes a man do something foolish just to prove he can. The people who knew him well described him as warm. Genuinely warm, not the performed warmth of a man running for office. He remembered names. He asked about children. He laughed easily and often. His old soldiers loved him. They called him Old Tippecanoe, a name he had earned in battle, and they said it with real affection. He was also, by most accounts, a man who trusted too easily. He believed in the goodness of the people around him. He took men at their word. In ordinary life, that quality makes a man well liked. In the White House in 1841, surrounded by men with their own plans and their own ambitions, that same quality made him something else. It made him vulnerable. He arrived in Washington full of energy and intention. He had plans. He had ideas about what his presidency would look like. He had a cabinet to appoint, and a country to run, and a point to prove to everyone who had doubted him. He had 31 days, and somewhere in those 31 days, something went wrong. Something that even now, nearly 200 years later, nobody can fully explain. The story of what happened to William Henry Harrison starts with the man himself. Warm hands, pale blue eyes, a long face turned toward the future. Before William Henry Harrison ever set foot in the White House, something old and heavy was already waiting for him. Not in Washington, not in any city. It was waiting in the soil of the Ohio River Valley, in the tall grass along the Tippecanoe River, in the memory of a people who had watched their world get taken away piece by piece. The curse that would follow Harrison didn't start with him. It started with his father, and it started with a name. His father was Benjamin Harrison, V, a Virginia planter, a man of land and tobacco and long summer afternoons on a wide porch overlooking green fields. Benjamin Harrison, V, signed the Declaration of Independence. He was one of the men who put his name on that paper and changed the world. His family had money. His family had standing. His family had everything a man in colonial Virginia could want. And then the war came. The British burned his plantation. They took his crops. They rode through his fields like a slow fire and left almost nothing behind. Benjamin Harrison V survived, but the family never fully recovered. The money got thin. The land got smaller. By the time young William Henry Harrison came into the world in 1773, the Harrison name still carried weight. But the fortune behind it was fading like smoke in an open field. William Henry grew up in that in-between place. Not poor, not rich, surrounded by the memory of greatness, but not quite touching it. He grew up in a big house called Berkeley Plantation on the James River in Virginia. You can still visit it today. The house is made of brick, the color of dried rust, 3 stories tall, with tall windows that look out over flat green lawns rolling down toward the water. In the morning, the river would catch the light and throw it back in long silver ribbons. It was a beautiful place to grow up. It was also a place full of ghosts. Harrison left Virginia young. He studied medicine for a while in Philadelphia. Then he joined the army. He was 17 years old. He traded the smell of river mud and tobacco fields for the smell of gunpowder and horse sweat and wet canvas tents. He moved west, into the territories, into the wild country beyond the Ohio River, where the trees grew so thick the sun barely touched the ground. That country changed him. He loved it. The open sky after the forest broke, the wide rivers running cold and fast, the feeling that the land went on forever and anything was possible. He married a woman named Anna Sims, whose father tried to talk her out of it. Her father thought Harrison had no money and no future. Anna married him anyway. They had 10 children together. 10. The house was always full of noise and motion, and the smell of whatever was cooking on the fire. Harrison built a life in the Northwest Territory. He became a governor. He became a soldier again. He fought battles. He made treaties. He pushed the boundary of American settlement further and further west into land that had belonged to other people for thousands of years. He was good at it. He was charming and brave, and people followed him. But there was a man watching all of this, a Shawnee leader named Tecumseh, and Tecumseh's brother, a prophet named Tenskwatawa, who people called the prophet. They were building something, a confederacy of tribes, a united front against the slow flood of American settlers moving into their lands. They had a village called Prophetstown, near the place where the Tippecanoe River meets the Wabash, in what is now Indiana. It was a real place, a living, breathing community of thousands of people who had decided to stand their ground. Harrison marched on that village in 1811. He burned it to the ground. And that is where the story gets strange. Because after the battle, after the smoke cleared and the village was ash, the prophet is said to have spoken. He laid a curse on Harrison, and not just on Harrison, on every American president elected in a year ending in 0. Every 20 years, a curse that would follow the office like a shadow follows a man on a bright afternoon. The Shawnee called it many things. Americans would later call it Tecumseh's curse, or the 0-year curse, or the curse of Tippecanoe. Harrison was the first. He died 31 days after taking office, and the presidents who came after him in those 0 years, one by one, they fell too. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to a cold March morning and a very long speech. There is a word that followed William Henry Harrison everywhere he went. You heard it in taverns. You heard it shouted from muddy street corners. You heard it printed in newspapers from Boston to the Georgia coast. The word was Tippecanoe. And if you said it out loud in 1840, people knew exactly what you meant. They knew the battle. They knew the general. They knew the story of the man who stood in the cold Indiana mud and faced down a confederation of warriors and walked away breathing. Tippecanoe. Say it slowly. It has a sound like a river over smooth stones. The battle itself happened in November of 1811, 30 years before Harrison ever set foot in the White House. He was a general then, commanding American forces near a river the Potawatomi called the Tippecanoe. The prophet, a Shawnee leader named Tenskwatawa, had gathered warriors from many nations at a place called Prophetstown. His brother was Tecumseh, and together they were building something that frightened the young American government deeply. They were building unity. Harrison moved his troops close to Prophetstown and made camp. In the gray hours before dawn, the warriors attacked first. The fighting was brutal and short. When the smoke cleared, Harrison's men held the field. They burned Prophetstown to the ground. Harrison rode home and called it a victory, but the people who lived along that river told a different story. They said the prophet stood at the edge of the burning town and raised his voice. Some accounts say he wept, Others say he did not weep at all, that his face was still as winter water. What everyone agrees on is that words came out of him, words directed at Harrison by name, words that were not a threat exactly, but something older than a threat, something closer to a declaration. The exact words changed every time someone wrote them down. That is how you know they came from a real place. Real things get blurred when people try to hold them, but the shape of the curse stayed the same across every version. Every great chief who became president would die in office. They would die in the year that ended in 0, and it would go on and on until the debt was paid. Harrison won the presidency in 1840, the year that ended in 0. Now here is the small thing, the thing that doesn't fit. 3 days before Harrison's inauguration, a man appeared at Gadsby's Hotel in Washington. This was a common enough place. Politicians stayed there, journalists, people who had business with the new administration. The man who arrived gave his name to the clerk and asked for a room near the back. He was described later as lean, older, dressed in dark wool that had seen better years. He carried no bags that anyone could see. He spoke quietly and with an accent that nobody could quite place. He stayed 2 nights. On the second night, a young hotel worker named Thomas, who swept the upper floors and kept the fires going, passed the man's room and heard something. He told the story later to his sister, and she wrote it down in a letter that survived in a private collection in Virginia. Thomas said he heard the man speaking, not loudly, not to anyone in the room, as far as Thomas could tell. Just a low, steady sound, like someone reciting something from memory. Thomas pressed his ear to the door for a moment. He was young and curious, and not yet wise enough to walk away from things he didn't understand. He said the words he heard were not English. He couldn't say what language they were. He had no frame for it. He just knew they weren't anything he'd heard before, not in the streets of Washington, not in the church he attended on Sunday mornings, not anywhere. The rhythm was strange, long and low, and then suddenly clipped, like something being measured out. Thomas walked away from the door and finished his work and didn't tell anyone for 3 days. By then, the man in the room was gone. clerk had no forwarding address. No one remembered seeing him leave. His name in the register was written in a hand so small and cramped that 2 different people later read it as 2 different names. Harrison gave his speech the next morning. 2 hours in the cold. No hat, no coat, and somewhere in the city, a fire was dying in a back room at Gadsby's hotel. The ashes were still warm. The bed had barely been slept in. The word Tippecanoe hung over everything like weather. People in Washington City talked. That was one thing you could always count on. The city was small enough that a rumor could travel from Capitol Hill to the Navy Yard before the ink dried on a broadsheet. And in the spring of 1841, the rumors were moving fast. The old-timers had things to say about the White House. They always did. But this time, what they said carried a different kind of weight. This wasn't gossip about parties or politics. This was something older. Something they spoke about in low voices close to the fire when the children had gone to bed. The building itself had a reputation, not a good one. Washington City was young, barely 40 years old, and already the ground beneath it had a history that made people uneasy. The land was marshy. The Potomac ran close. In summer, the air above the low parts of the city turned thick and yellow, and people who breathed it too long got sick in ways that doctors couldn't always explain. Locals called it the miasma. They believed bad air rose from the swamps at night, like a slow, invisible tide, and that it settled into the lungs of anyone foolish enough to sleep with their windows open. The White House sat right in the middle of all of it. The south lawn ran down toward a stretch of open ground that flooded when the river rose. Stagnant pools gathered there in wet seasons. Mosquitoes rose from the water in clouds so thick they looked like smoke. The servants who worked the lower floors of the mansion knew this better than anyone. They talked about it among themselves. They had their own names for the smell that drifted in through the cellar walls on warm nights. They said it smelled like old copper and river mud, and something else they couldn't quite name. One old groundskeeper, a man who had worked the property since the days of John Adams, told anyone who would listen that the the south side of the building was cursed ground. He didn't mean it as a figure of speech. He meant it plainly, the way you'd say a well had gone bad or a field wouldn't grow corn. The ground was wrong, he said. Things that went into it didn't come back out right. People at the taverns near Pennsylvania Avenue traded stories about the presidents who had lived there. John Adams had been miserable in the place. Abigail Adams had hung laundry in the East Room because the building was so damp and cold that nothing dried outside. Thomas Jefferson had complained about the drafts. James Madison had watched the whole thing burn to the ground in 1814, and some people quietly said that the fire had been almost a mercy, a chance to start clean. But they rebuilt on the same spot, same ground, same low, wet earth. The building that Harrison moved into in 1841 was 40 years old and already tired. The walls held moisture. The basement flooded in heavy rains. The kitchen and the servants' quarters sat in the ground floor, close to the soil, close to whatever moved through it. The water that came into the house came from somewhere nearby, somewhere that the city's growing population had already begun to crowd and contaminate. Nobody thought much about that. Water was water. But the old women who sold herbs and roots near the market on Pennsylvania Avenue thought about it. They had their own understanding of sickness, passed down through generations, and they said that the White House sat in a bad place. They said the water there tasted of iron and rot. They said that a man who drank it long enough would hollow out from the inside, slow and quiet, like a log going soft in a wet field. When word spread that the new president had taken ill within days of moving in, these women nodded. They weren't surprised. They had been watching the building for years, the way you watch a neighbor's house when you know the foundation is sinking. The church steps had their own version of the story. Some people said God was making a statement. Harrison had been elected on noise and celebration, and a slogan that didn't mean much. And now the noise had gone quiet. Some said the land itself was settling a debt. The city had been built on swamp and compromise, and things better left undisturbed. And eventually, all of that came due. Nobody had the full picture. Nobody ever does in a city like that. But every voice added something. Every story fit against the next one like stones in a wall. And the wall, when you stepped back and looked at it, told a story that no single person had meant to tell. Now here is where the story gets heavy. William Henry Harrison had been sick for 3 days. His chest rattled when he breathed. His skin burned like the coals of a fire that wouldn't die down. The doctors came, and what they did next is the part that most history books skip right past. Medicine in 1841 was not what it is today. That is not a judgment. It is just a fact. The men who walked into Harrison's bedroom carried black leather bags full of things that would make a modern doctor go pale. They believed with all their hearts that sickness lived in the blood, that the body held too much of something bad, that the cure was to take it out. So they did. The first treatment was bloodletting. They opened a vein in Harrison's arm and let the blood run out into a bowl. They believed this would cool the fever. Instead, it made a 68-year-old man weaker. His body had been fighting for 3 days already. Now it had less to fight with. Then came the opium. They gave him opium to help him sleep. They gave him castor oil to move his bowels. They gave him something called calomel, which is a compound made from mercury. Mercury, the same silver liquid you see in old thermometers. They put it inside a sick man's body. They believed it would purge whatever poison the illness had left behind. What it actually did was poison him from the inside. Calomel was a common medicine in that era. Doctors used it for everything. Fevers, infections, stomach troubles. They had no way of knowing that mercury accumulates in the body, that it doesn't leave, that it builds up in the organs and the blood and the soft tissue, and slowly, quietly, it shuts things down. Harrison's doctors gave him dose after dose. They also gave him something called Peruvian bark, which contains quinine. That part might have helped a little, but then they added snake root. And then they added camphor. And then petroleum. And then brandy mixed with laudanum. They were throwing everything they had at a man who was already drowning. Picture a fire. You want to put it out, so you throw water on it, then sand, then a blanket, then more water second blanket. At some point, the fire is not your biggest problem anymore. That is what happened in that bedroom. The head physician was a man named Thomas Miller. He was not a bad man. He was not a cruel man. He was a doctor of his time, doing exactly what his training told him to do. But his training was built on ideas that were wrong. And the President of the United States paid for those wrong ideas with his life. Now here is the part that connects to something older, the practice of bleeding a patient, of purging them, of flooding their body with heavy metals, did not start in 1841. It goes back centuries. It goes back to a theory of medicine called humorism. The ancient Greeks believed the body ran on 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of one meant sickness. The cure was to drain it out or flush it through. European settlers brought that belief across the ocean. They carried it into every new town, every frontier post, every city they built on land they had taken. They built their hospitals on it. They trained their doctors on it. And the people who had lived on this land long before them, the people whose medicine grew from the earth itself, from roots and bark, and the slow knowledge of generations, those people watched. Some of them tried to share what they knew. Most of the time, nobody listened. There is a quiet irony in that. The bark of the cinchona tree, which gives us quinine, came to European medicine through indigenous knowledge in South America. The settlers took the plant. They left the wisdom that came with it. Harrison's doctors had a piece of the old knowledge, just a piece, not enough. So they bled him. They dosed him with mercury. They gave him brandy and opium and camphor and snake root. And with every treatment, the man who had survived the Battle of Tippecanoe, who had lived through frontier winters and river crossings and years of hard soldiering, grew a little smaller, a little dimmer. The fever was one thing. The cures were another thing entirely. And somewhere in the space between those two things, the 31st President of the United States slipped away. There is a man you should know about. His name was John Bell, not the famous one from Tennessee, not the man the Bell Witch haunted. This was a different John Bell, a quiet man, a careful man, a journalist from Philadelphia who came to Washington in the spring of 1841 with a notebook and a suspicion he couldn't quite name. He had read the papers. Everyone had. Harrison was dead. The doctors said pneumonia. The city said grief. But Bell had spent enough time around powerful men to know that the official story and the true story were rarely the same animal. So he walked Pennsylvania Avenue. He walked it slowly, the way a man walks when he's looking for something he might not recognize. The avenue was wide and muddy in those days. The air smelled of horse and coal smoke and something else underneath, something damp and old, like a cellar that never fully dried. The White House sat at the end of it all, pale and still, like a face that had forgotten how to smile. Bell started asking questions. He talked to shopkeepers. He talked to the men who hauled water and the women who sold bread from carts near the market. He talked to anyone who would stand still long enough to answer him. And what he heard again and again was the same quiet complaint. The water. Something was wrong with the water. Washington City in 1841 was not a place with clean pipes and careful systems. The water came from wells. Some of those wells sat close to the river. Some of them sat even closer to something worse. Just 2 blocks east of the White House, the city had built its main sewage pit. A long, shallow trench that collected waste from the surrounding buildings and let it seep slowly into the ground that held the wells that fed the kitchens. Bell wrote this down in small, tight letters. He drew a rough map. He marked the distance between the sewage trench and the nearest well that served the president's house. It was not a long distance. It was, in fact, a very short one. He found a man named Tobias Greer, a laborer who had worked on the grounds near the White House for 3 years. Greer told Bell that the well water had smelled strange the previous winter. Not always, not every day, but on certain mornings when the wind came from the east and the ground was soft from rain, the water had a smell to it, like something mineral and wrong, like old copper left in standing water. Bell pressed him. Had anyone reported this? Greer laughed, not a happy laugh, but the kind of laugh that means a man already knows the answer. Nobody reports things like that, Greer told him. You just drink it and hope. spent 3 days in Washington. He walked the same streets each morning. He watched the water carriers move through the city with their heavy buckets, the water sloshing dark and still in the gray spring light. He watched the kitchen doors of the White House open and close. He thought about a man who had stood in the cold rain for 2 hours and then come inside to drink from those wells every single day for a month. He never published what he found. Not fully. He wrote a short piece for a small Philadelphia paper, careful and vague, full of phrases like questions remain, and the matter deserves attention. The bigger papers didn't pick it up. The city had moved on. John Tyler was already in the president's chair, already making decisions, already signing papers. The country had no appetite for looking backward. But Bell kept his notebook. He kept his map. He kept the name Tobias Greer written in the margin with a small star beside it. The way a man marks something he hasn't finished thinking about. The notebook sat in a trunk. The trunk sat in a house in Philadelphia. The house eventually passed to Bell's daughter, and then to her children. And somewhere in that long chain of years and moves and ordinary life, the notebook disappeared, the way most things disappear, not dramatically, just slowly, quietly, the way a fire goes out when no one is watching. But the map Bell drew was not entirely wrong. The sewage trench was real. The wells were real. The distance between them was real. And the water that moved beneath Pennsylvania Avenue in the winter of 1841 carried things in it that no one had names for yet, things that could make a strong man weak, things that could make a sick man die, things that moved through the ground like a slow and patient secret, waiting for someone to finally drink. There are people in this story who never made the history books. They didn't give speeches. They didn't sign papers. They just lived inside those walls day after day, and they noticed things. One of them was a man named Edward Donahue. He worked as a steward in the White House during the early months of 1841. His job was simple. He kept the household running. He ordered food. He managed the staff. He made sure the fires stayed lit and the floors stayed clean. He was the kind of man who paid attention to details because his job depended on it. Edward kept a private journal famous one, not the kind that ends up behind glass in a museum. Just a small leather book he wrote in at night by candlelight before he went to sleep. Some pages from that journal survived, and what he wrote is quiet and strange. He wrote about the smell. He said the lower floors of the White House had a smell that winter. Not the smell of wood smoke or candle wax or the kitchen. Something older, something damp and sour, like the earth itself was breathing up through the floorboards. He wrote that it came and went. Some mornings it was strong enough to make his eyes water. Other mornings it was gone entirely, and he wondered if he had imagined it. He didn't imagine it. He also wrote about the water. He said the drinking water that season tasted different than it had before. Flat, slightly bitter, the way water tastes when it's been sitting too long in a metal pipe. He mentioned it to one of the cooks, a woman named Margaret, and she agreed. She said she'd been boiling it longer than usual, just to feel better about it. But she kept using it. Everyone did. There wasn't another choice. Margaret's own account comes down through her family. Her great-granddaughter gave an interview to a local Virginia newspaper in the 1940s, and she repeated what had been passed down to her. Margaret said the president's meals were prepared with care. She was proud of her work, but she also said that in those first weeks of March, something felt wrong in that kitchen. She couldn't name it. She just said the air felt heavy, like the moment before a storm that never quite arrives. She also said the president ate very little. He was polite about it. He thanked her for the food, but he pushed things around his plate more than he ate them. She thought he was simply tired. She thought the job had worn him down before it had even truly started. There was another witness, a young man who worked as a groundskeeper, whose name has been recorded only as Thomas W. in a few secondary sources. Thomas worked the south grounds and the area near the servants' entrance. He said that in late March, he noticed something odd near the drainage channel that ran along the back of the property. The ground there was soft and wet, even on dry days. He said there was a dark stain spreading through the soil, like ink dropped into water. He reported it to his supervisor. Nothing was done. Thomas said he watched that stain grow over the following week. He didn't know what it meant. He just knew it wasn't right. He said the grass nearby turned yellow and flat, the way grass does when something beneath it is sick. These are small details. You might be tempted to wave them away. A smell, a taste, a stain in the dirt. None of it sounds like evidence of anything. But here is what makes these accounts worth holding on to. None of these people knew each other well. They worked in different parts of the house. They moved in different circles. And yet they all noticed the same things independently in the same weeks. The smell, the water, the soft ground, the president who wasn't eating. They weren't trying to tell a story. They were just telling what they saw. There is something honest about a person who writes in a private journal at night, not for anyone else, just to get the thing out of their head. Edward Donahue wasn't building a case. He was just a careful man who noticed the world around him, and something about that world felt off, and he wrote it down because writing it down was the only thing he could do. He kept working. Margaret kept cooking. Thomas kept tending the grounds. And upstairs, the president kept getting worse. There were men who needed William Henry Harrison to fail, not just politically, not just in the way that rivals always want the other side to lose. These men needed him gone in a way that felt personal, urgent, like something was at stake that went far beyond the next election. To understand who they were, you have to understand what Harrison represented. He was a Whig. The Whig Party had clawed its way into power for the first time in American history. And the men who had run things before, the Democrats, the old guard, the ones who had built their lives around Andrew Jackson's vision of America, they were not gracious about losing. Andrew Jackson himself despised Harrison. That's not a rumor. Jackson wrote letters about it. He called Harrison weak. He called him a fool. He said the country would suffer for choosing him. Jackson was old and sick by 1841, living out his days at his Tennessee plantation, but his network was still alive. His people were still in Washington. They still had friends in the right rooms. Then there was John C. Calhoun, the man from South Carolina who had spent decades fighting for Southern power and states' rights. Calhoun had served as vice president under under 2 different presidents. He knew how Washington worked at the bone level. He had allies everywhere. And Harrison's election threatened everything Calhoun had spent his life building. Calhoun was not in Harrison's cabinet. He had no official role, but he was in the city. He was watching, and men like Calhoun always had a way of being close to the center of things without ever leaving a fingerprint. You have to hold those names gently. Jackson, Calhoun. There's no document that ties them to anything that happened inside the White House. No confession. No letter that says what you might want it to say. But the shape of their presence around this story is hard to ignore. Here is what the pattern looks like when you lay it flat. Harrison arrived in Washington with a clear vision. He planned to limit executive power. He planned to restore authority to Congress. He planned to dismantle some of the machinery that Jackson had built during his 8 years in office. These were not small ideas. They were threats to real people with real money and real influence. Within days of his arrival, those people started showing up at the White House. The building was open. Anyone could walk in, and they did. Office seekers, favor hunters, old enemies wearing friendly faces. Harrison shook every hand. He met with everyone. He was that kind of man. Some of those visitors came more than once. Some of them came in the evenings when the crowds had thinned. Some of them came when Harrison was already tired, already worn down by the relentless pressure of the job he had just started. The doctors who treated Harrison in his final weeks wrote down very little about who had been in contact with him. That's not unusual for the time. Medical records in 1841 were not what they are today. But the absence of that information leaves a door open that nobody has ever fully closed. Now think about the water. You heard about the water in an earlier part of this story. The sewage running beneath Pennsylvania Avenue. The contamination that sat just below the surface of the city. That contamination was real. It was there. It made people sick. But here is the thing about typhoid. Here is the thing about the kind of illness that comes from bad water. It tends to spread. It tends to move through households, through neighborhoods. It doesn't usually stop at one man. Harrison's staff lived in that building. His servants slept downstairs. His doctors visited daily. And yet the illness that took the president did not spread to anyone around him. Not one documented case of anyone else in the White House falling sick during those 31 days. That detail is quiet. It doesn't shout, but once you hear it, it sits with you. A contagious disease that only touched one man. A man surrounded by enemies who had every reason to want him gone. A city full of people who knew how to move through power without being seen. The pattern doesn't prove anything. Patterns rarely do, but they point. They lean in a direction. And when you follow where this one leans, you find yourself standing in a room with a small group of men who understood exactly what was at stake and who had the patience to wait for the right moment. Daniel Webster was in that room. That one fact sits at the center of this whole story like a stone at the bottom of a clear stream. You can see it. You can reach for it. But the current keeps moving around it, and nothing ever quite settles. Webster was one of the most powerful men in America in 1841. He had a voice like rolling thunder and a mind like a steel trap. He had run for president himself. He had lost. And now he sat in Harrison's cabinet as Secretary of State, the highest position in the room, the man closest to the president's ear. He was there when Harrison fell ill. He was there as the illness deepened. He was there at the end. And here is what the old stories say. Webster was not just a witness. He was a presence, a force, a man with his own plans and his own people, and his own reasons for being exactly where he was. Think about the room itself. The White House in those weeks was not quiet. It was full of men. Office seekers crowded the hallways from morning to night, pressing their cases, asking for appointments, demanding favors. The air inside smelled of tobacco and damp wool, and the particular anxious sweat of ambition. Harrison walked among them every day, shaking hands, listening, trying to be the president he had promised to be. Webster moved through those same halls with a different kind of ease. He had been in rooms like this his whole life. He knew how power worked. He knew who to talk to and who to ignore, and how to position himself so that when the moment came, he would be standing in the right place. The moment came faster than than anyone expected. By the end of the first week of April, Harrison was confined to his bed. The doctors came and went. The remedies got stranger and more desperate. And Webster, by all accounts, remained close. He was part of the inner circle that gathered around the dying president. He helped manage the flow of information in and out of the sick room. He decided, along with a small group of men, what the public would hear and when they would hear it. That kind of control is worth thinking about slowly. When a president is sick, the people around him become very powerful. They decide who gets access. They shape the story. They write the letters and make the decisions that the president can no longer make for himself. In those 31 days, a small group of men held the country in their hands, and Webster was among them. Now, the old stories do not say Webster poisoned Harrison with his own hands. That is not how these things work, and it is not how the legend has been passed down. What the stories say is quieter than that. They say Webster knew things. They say he was positioned to benefit. They say that the men around Harrison in those final weeks were not all there out of loyalty. Webster had opposed Harrison on key questions before the election. He had his own vision for the country, his own allies, his own debts to pay. A Harrison who lived and governed strongly would have been a problem for some of those plans. A Harrison who died would leave the field open. That is the shape of the suspicion, not a smoking gun. A pattern of presence and motive and convenience. There is one story that gets told in certain circles, passed down through the kind of people who keep old papers and long memories. It says that in the final days, when Harrison was barely conscious, Webster sat by the bedside for a long stretch of time. Alone. The servants were sent out. The doctors were not present. Just Webster and the dying president in a room that smelled of camphor and sickness, and the slow turning of the season outside the window. Nobody knows what was said in that room. Nobody knows what was done. The servants who were sent away did not speak of it publicly, at least not in any record that survived. But they noticed. People always notice, and the noticing gets passed down even when the words do not. Webster left Washington after Harrison died. He stayed on briefly under Tyler, then resigned. He went back to his law practice, his speeches, his long career. He lived another 11 years. He never wrote about those weeks in any detail that anyone has found. The room where Harrison died still stands inside the White House. The walls have been repainted many times. The air has changed. But Webster was in that room, and that fact does not go away. Here is the thing about 31 days. Most people know the number. They know Harrison died fast. They know he gave a long speech in the cold, and then he was gone. That's the story people carry around. That's the version that fits on a plaque. But 31 days is not fast. Not really. Think about it. A man catches a cold on March 4th. He is sick by March 9th. He is dead on April 4th. That is nearly a full month of dying. A full month of doctors coming and going. A full month of medicines and treatments and consultations. A full month of people standing in that room, watching, waiting, deciding what to do next. 31 days is a long time to be in a room with a sick man. Here is the detail that doesn't get talked about. In those 31 days, Harrison had good days, real good days, days where he sat up, days where he spoke clearly, days where the doctors looked at each other and nodded like maybe this was turning around. His personal secretary, Thomas Ewing, wrote in his notes that on March 26th, Harrison seemed almost himself. He was alert. He was asking questions. He wanted to know about the mail. That was 22 days in. Then something changed. Not slowly, not gradually. Something shifted hard and fast, and within 9 days, he was gone. That kind of pattern has a name in medicine. Doctors today call it a relapse, a second wave. The body fights back, seems to win, and then something new comes in and finishes the job. It happens. It's real. It's documented. But here's what makes people stop and stare at this particular case. On March 27th, the day after Harrison seemed almost well, a new round of treatments began. The doctors had been arguing. There were at least 4 of them in that house by then, maybe more. They disagreed on almost everything. But on March 27th, they reached some kind of agreement. They changed the treatment. They added new medicines. They shifted the plan. And Harrison never had another good day after that. Now, that could mean nothing. A sick man gets sicker. Doctors try new things. Sometimes nothing works. This was 1841. Medicine was brutal and blunt, and often made things worse. That is a known fact. That is not a mystery. But here is the impossible detail. One of the medicines added to Harrison's treatment on March 27th was a compound that contained a small amount of arsenic. This was not unusual for the time. Arsenic was used in medicine throughout the 1800s. It was in tonics, in powders, in treatments for fever and infection. Doctors gave it to patients the way a doctor today might give you a vitamin. It was ordinary. The impossible detail is not that they gave him arsenic. The impossible detail is that nobody wrote it down. Every other medicine Harrison received during those 31 days is recorded somewhere. The opium, the castor oil, the brandy, the calomel, which is mercury chloride and is its own dark story. All of it is in the records. All of it is in the letters and the notes and the accounts that historians have picked through for nearly 200 years. The arsenic compound is mentioned once in a single letter, written by one doctor to another doctor after Harrison was already dead. That letter sat in a private collection for over 100 years. It wasn't widely known until researchers started pulling on threads in the late 20th century. And even then, most people looked at it and said, well, arsenic was common. It doesn't mean anything. Maybe it doesn't. But you sit with that for a moment. You sit with the image of a man who was getting better. A man who asked about his mail. A man who, for one brief afternoon in late March, felt like himself again inside that cold and drafty house on Pennsylvania Avenue. And then the next morning, the doctors changed the plan. And the one thing they added that nobody bothered to write down was the one thing that, in large enough doses, causes exactly the symptoms Harrison showed in his final 9 days: vomiting, weakness, confusion. A body that seems to be fighting itself from the inside. 31 days. One good afternoon. One letter nobody found for a century. You don't have to call it anything. You don't have to decide what it means. some details just sit there in the light and refuse to go away. They don't ask to be explained. They just ask to be seen. Not everyone believes it was poison. That's worth saying out loud, because the skeptics aren't fools. They're not people who looked away from the evidence. They're people who looked straight at it and said, "This is a sick man who got sicker." That happens. It happened all the time in 1841. It still happens now. Their argument is simple and it's strong. William Henry Harrison was 68 years old. He stood in freezing rain for 2 hours without a hat or a coat. He gave the longest inaugural address any president had ever given. Nearly 2 hours of cold air moving through his lungs. Then he walked in a parade. Then he shook hands for hours more. He was an old man doing the work of 3 young ones, and his body paid the price. That's not a mystery. That's just what happens. The doctors who treated him wrote down what they saw. Pneumonia, pleurisy, enteric fever. These were real diseases. They were common diseases. The White House sat above a swamp, remember? The water table under Pennsylvania Avenue was thick with the kind of bacteria that killed people every summer. Poor sanitation, open sewage, the same water that made servants sick made presidents sick too. The skeptics point to this and say, "You don't need poison when you have that." And they're right that the symptoms fit. A cough that started early and never left. Chills that came and went like weather. A fever that climbed slowly, then fast. These are the tracks of a respiratory infection moving into the blood. Any doctor in any century would recognize that picture. The body of a 68-year-old man, already worn down, already tired, already standing in the cold for hours. That body doesn't need help to fail. The skeptics also point to the timeline. Harrison got sick on March 26th, 9 days after he took office. If someone wanted to poison him, why wait 9 days? Why not sooner? Why not in the food at the inaugural dinner? Why not in the wine at one of the parties that followed? The delay, they say, looks more like a natural infection than a planned one. Infections take time to bloom. Poison, if it was meant to kill, would have moved faster. These are fair points. Every single one of them. But here's where the skeptics go quiet. The fever moved in a pattern that doctors at the time found unusual. Not wrong exactly, not impossible, but unusual. It would drop. Harrison would feel better. He would sit up, take broth, speak clearly, seem almost himself again. Then the fever would return, higher than before. This happened more than once. A wave pulling back, then crashing forward again. His attending physician, Thomas Miller, noted the improvement, and then the sudden reversal with something close to confusion in his words. He didn't understand why the body kept rallying and then collapsing. Natural pneumonia can do this. It can. But the specific rhythm of Harrison's illness, the way it seemed to pause, breathe, and then accelerate, matches something else too. It matches what arsenic poisoning looks like when it's administered in doses spread over time. Small amounts, enough to weaken, not enough to kill immediately. The body fights back between doses. Then the next dose arrives, and the fight gets harder. That's the gap the skeptics can't fully close. They can explain the illness. They can explain the bacteria in the water. They can explain the cold and the age and the bad medical care. What they can't fully explain is the rhythm. The way the sickness seemed to have a schedule. The way Harrison improved at exactly the moments when visitors came and went, when the room around him changed, when the people with access to his food and medicine shifted. Illness doesn't have a schedule. Illness doesn't check the calendar. The skeptics will tell you that pattern recognition is dangerous, that the human mind finds shapes in random things, that we see plans where there are none because plans are easier to accept than chaos. And they're right about that too. The mind does do that. It's one of the oldest tricks the brain plays on itself. But the fever moved like it had a plan. That's not a conclusion. It's just what the record shows. A man who got better when he should have gotten worse, and worse when he should have gotten better. A rhythm that doesn't quite fit the disease they said he had. The skeptics are smart. They've thought this through. They just can't explain the rhythm. There are people who saw what happened to William Henry Harrison, not from a distance, not from the hallway. They were in the room. They held the bowls. They carried the bottles. They watched a man get sicker every time the doctors came to help him, and some of them talked, not loudly, not in newspapers or pamphlets. They talked the way people talk when they know something dangerous, quietly, to family, to friends they trusted, in letters that got folded up and put away in drawers for decades. What they said was simple. The remedies made him worse. Every single time. You have to understand what medicine looked like in 1841. Doctors believed in something called heroic medicine. The idea was that the body needed to be pushed hard to heal itself. You didn't rest a sick man. You attacked the sickness with everything you had. Castor oil, opium, camphor, brandy, laudanum, bloodletting, blistering the skin with hot plasters until it peeled away. These were not gentle treatments. They were assaults, and Harrison's doctors used all of them. Dr. Thomas Miller was one of the men at the bedside. He kept notes. He recorded every treatment, every dose, every change in the president's condition. When you read those notes today, a picture forms. Harrison would stabilize. He'd show a little color. His breathing would ease. And then the doctors would come back with another round of treatment. And within hours, he'd be worse than before. This happened again and again over 31 days. The people who believed something was wrong pointed to a man named John Cockburn. He was a servant in the White House. He had no reason to lie and nothing to gain by speaking. But years later, he told people close to him that he had watched the president's face change after certain treatments, not the slow gray of a man fading from illness, something faster, something that moved through him like a wave. Cockburn said the president looked frightened, that he knew something was happening to him that he couldn't name. There was a woman named Mary Donahue who worked in the kitchen during those weeks. Her account came down through her family. She said the smells coming from the sick room were wrong. She'd been around illness her whole life. She knew what a fever smelled like, what a body fighting infection smelled like. What she smelled in that hallway was different. Sharp, chemical, like something burning from the inside out. She told her daughter. Her daughter told her children. The story moved forward the way these stories do, passed hand to hand like a coal kept warm against the cold. Now, none of this is proof. The believers know that. They've always known that. What they have are impressions, patterns, the weight of too many small things pointing in the same direction. They point to the timing of the treatments. They point to the fact that the doctors who attended Harrison were not all his own men. Some of them came from outside his circle. Some of them were recommended by people with reasons to want a different man in the president's chair. They point to the opium. Harrison was given opium in large doses. Opium slows the body down. It quiets the lungs. In a man already fighting a respiratory illness, it does not help him breathe. It does the opposite. The believers say this was known, that any doctor worth his training would have understood what opium did to a man with pneumonia. And yet, they kept giving it to him. The castor oil was given in doses that would have stripped the lining from a healthy man's gut. The bloodletting took strength he couldn't spare. The blistering treatments burned his skin raw and left him in pain that exhausted him further. Each remedy took something from him, and nothing gave anything back. The believers are not angry people, mostly. They're not the kind who shout. They're the kind who sit with something for a long time and let it settle. They look at what happened to Harrison and they say quietly that the math doesn't work. That a strong man, 68 years old, but still vigorous, still sharp, doesn't fall apart that fast from a cold rain and a long speech. Not unless something is helping him fall. They say the doctors had the means. They say some of the men around Harrison had the motive. And they say the treatments, whether by design or by terrible accident, finished what the illness started. They don't need you to agree. They've made their peace with the uncertainty. They just want the question to stay open. And it has. The White House in the spring of 1841 was a house full of people who kept their eyes down. There were servants. There were stewards. There were men who carried wood and women who carried linens, and people whose entire job was to move quietly through rooms where important things were happening. They heard conversations. They noticed things. And they said almost nothing. Not then, not ever, because that was the deal. You kept the house. You kept the secrets. You kept your mouth shut. But silence is not the same as forgetting. Some of what they saw leaked out slowly, the way water finds a crack in old stone. came out in letters written decades later, in stories passed down through families, in small details that didn't mean much on their own, but started to mean something when you set them side by side and let the light fall across them. One thing that comes up again and again is the smell. Not the smell of sickness, though there was plenty of that. This was something else, something sharp and chemical underneath the normal smells of the house. The servants described it in different ways. Bitter, like something burned, like the air near a tannery on a hot day. One account, passed through a family in Virginia for generations, described it as the smell of old pennies left in a warm pocket. That description is worth sitting with for a moment. The White House sat on ground that was already troubled. Pennsylvania Avenue ran along what had once been a marshy lowland, and the earth beneath the building held water the way a sponge holds water. The sewage system was barely a system at all. The wells were shallow, the drainage was poor, and the smell that rose from the lower floors on warm days was something the staff had learned to live with, and the residents had learned to ignore. But the servants knew the difference between the smell of bad water and something else entirely. They also noticed the pattern of who came and went from the president's rooms. Doctors came and went constantly, which was expected. But there were other visitors, men who arrived without announcement and left without being recorded in the official logs. Men who carried small cases or leather bags. Men who spoke quietly in the hallway outside the president's door, and then left before anyone could ask their names. One of the stewards, whose account survived in a letter written to his brother, described watching a man he did not recognize spend nearly an hour in the kitchen, not eating, not talking to the cook, just standing near the preparation area, watching. When the steward asked who he was, the man said he was a physician's assistant. He left before anyone could confirm it. The cook remembered him too. She said he touched nothing. He just watched. Now, you could explain all of that away. Busy house, sick president, lots of people moving through. Confusion was natural. Records were incomplete. Nobody was keeping a careful log of every face that passed through the door. But the servants weren't confused. They knew who belonged and who didn't. That was their entire job. And several of them, in accounts that surfaced years and decades later, described the same feeling. Something was off. Something was happening that they couldn't name, and they knew better than to name it out loud. The land around the White House seemed to feel it too, in the way that old places sometimes do. The gardens on the south side of the building had been planted with care, but that spring, certain sections wouldn't hold. Plants that should have taken root didn't. The soil in one corner of the grounds stayed wet and dark long after the rains had stopped, as if something beneath it was seeping upward. The groundskeepers noted it. Nobody investigated. There was a dog that belonged to one of the household staff. A calm animal, well behaved, used to the noise and traffic of a busy building. In the weeks of the president's illness, the dog refused to go above the ground floor. It would sit at the bottom of the stairs and look up and not move. The woman who owned it said she had never seen the animal behave that way before. She never saw it behave that way again after the president died. Animals notice things we don't. Old houses hold things we can't explain, and the people who worked inside those walls, the ones who carried the trays and swept the floors and moved through rooms like shadows, they noticed everything. They just knew better than to say so while it still mattered. There is a pattern in American history that most people never notice. It hides in plain sight, buried under dates and names and official causes of death. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. A powerful man rises. He makes enemies. He gets sick in a way nobody can quite explain. And then he's gone. Harrison was not the first. He would not be the last. Go back 30 years before Harrison ever set foot in the White House. Go back to 1809, to a cold stone building in the city of Washington, and a man named Meriwether Lewis. You know that name. He walked across the continent with William Clark. He mapped rivers that no white man had ever seen. He came home a hero, and the country loved him for it. Then the country forgot him. Lewis was appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory. He made powerful enemies there too. Men who wanted the land. Men who wanted the money that came with the land. By 1809, Lewis was in debt, under investigation, and traveling south toward New Orleans to sort out his affairs. He stopped at a small inn along the Natchez Trace in Tennessee, a place called Grinder's Stand. That night, shots rang out. The official story said Lewis took his own life. 2 gunshots, and he was gone before morning. But the people who found him said the wounds didn't match that story. His hands were cut. His face was bruised. The innkeeper's wife, who heard everything through a thin wooden wall, said she heard him walking and talking for hours before the shots. She said he sounded like a man in conversation, not a man alone. The government closed the case fast. Very fast. Sound familiar? Now move forward in time. Move to 1848, just 7 years after Harrison's death. A man named John Quincy Adams collapsed on the floor of the House of Representatives. He was 80 years old, and he had been fighting against the expansion of slavery for years. He had made enemies the way some men collect friends. He died 2 days later in the Capitol building, in a small room just off the House chamber. Nobody poisoned John Quincy Adams. That story has never been told. His death looked like a stroke, and it probably was. But the pattern is still there. The old fighter, the powerful enemies, the sudden collapse, the quick and quiet end. History has a way of rhyming. Now move further west. Move to the frontier towns of the 1850s and 1860s, where men with money and ambition played for very high stakes. There are stories from those years, passed down through families in Missouri and Kentucky and Ohio, about men who drank from the wrong cup at the wrong dinner table. Men who felt fine in the morning and were dead by Thursday. Doctors shrugged. Wives wept. The land changed hands. Arsenic was called inheritance powder in Europe for a reason. It was cheap. It was tasteless. It left almost no trace in a body that had already been buried in summer heat. And in the 1840s in America, nobody was testing for it. Nobody had the tools. Nobody had the reason. Or maybe they had the reason. They just didn't have the courage. Harrison's story fits into this longer, quieter tradition, not of grand conspiracies with secret meetings and signed documents, but of something smaller and more human, of men who saw an obstacle and removed it, of doctors who knew which remedies helped and which ones didn't, of servants who kept their eyes down and their mouths shut because they had families to feed. The night Harrison's voice went quiet for good was April 3rd, 1841. He had been slipping for days. The remedies had piled up like stones on a chest. His breathing had grown shallow. The men around him took turns sitting at his bedside, watching, waiting. He spoke his last words to his doctor. Some accounts say he was talking to John Tyler, though Tyler wasn't in the room. He said, "Take care of the country," or something close to that. The exact words depend on who was telling the story and when. By 9 in the evening, he was gone. The room went quiet. The candles kept burning. Outside, Washington was dark and cold, the way it always is in early April, when winter hasn't quite decided to leave. And somewhere in that city, in a house or a hotel room or a warm office lit by firelight, someone heard the news and felt something they didn't show on their face. History doesn't record what that feeling was, but it records what happened next. There is a letter in the Ohio Historical Society. It sits in a flat archival box, sealed behind acid-free paper, handled maybe twice a year by white-gloved researchers. The ink has faded to a pale brown, like old tea. The handwriting is careful and small, and if you read it closely, you notice something strange. The writer mentions the president's death almost as an afterthought. Not grief, not shock, just a quiet acknowledgement, like someone noting the weather had turned. That letter was written on April 4th, 1841, the same day Harrison died. Think about what that means. The news traveled by horse and by wire. It could not have reached the letter's recipient in time for a reply, which means the writer already knew something was coming. Or they wrote the letter before the news broke and simply filled in the date later. Nobody has ever explained that. Harrison died on a Sunday morning just after midnight. By Monday, the city was already moving. Not mourning, moving. There is a difference. Mourning is slow and heavy, like wet wool. What happened in Washington that week was fast and purposeful, like water finding a drain. The body was prepared quickly. embalming methods of 1841 were rough and imperfect. Ice was packed around the corpse to slow the decay. The White House staff worked through the night. By Tuesday, the public viewing had already been arranged. By Thursday, the funeral procession moved through the streets of Washington under a gray April sky. 17 days later, the body was loaded onto a steamboat and sent up the Ohio River toward North Bend, Ohio, Harrison's home, his burial ground. That steamboat journey took several days. The coffin was made of lead-lined wood, sealed against the spring air. Lead lining was not common for the time. It was expensive. It was the kind of choice you made when you wanted to make sure nothing leaked out or nothing got in. There are photographs from the funeral procession, daguerreotypes technically, because photography was brand new in 1841 and barely understood. The images are blurry and silver gray, like looking at the past through frosted glass. In one of them, you can see the funeral carriage moving down Pennsylvania Avenue. The crowd lines the street, hats removed, heads bowed. But in the background of that image, slightly out of focus, there are two figures standing apart from the crowd. They are not watching the procession. They are watching each other. One appears to be holding something, a folded paper, maybe a letter. Nobody has ever identified them. It is probably nothing. Most things are probably nothing, but you notice it, and then you can't stop noticing it. Harrison's personal effects were cataloged after his death. The list still exists. It includes his clothing, his books, his writing instruments, and a small wooden box that appears on the inventory and then disappears from every subsequent record. No description of its contents. No note about where it went. Just a box listed once, never mentioned again. His doctor, Thomas Miller, kept detailed notes during those final days. Those notes were published in a medical journal shortly after the death. But the original handwritten version, the one with the crossed out words and the margin notes, the one that shows what Miller was actually thinking before he edited himself. That version was donated to a private collection in the 1860s and has not been seen since. What gets crossed out matters. The clean version of a story is never the whole story. Harrison's personal Bible traveled with him to Washington. It was a thick, worn book, the kind that shows years of use in the cracked spine and the soft corners. After his death, it was returned to his family. Inside the front cover, someone had written a single line in pencil, in handwriting that did not match Harrison's own. The line read simply, "He was not meant to stay." His family said they did not know who wrote it. They kept the Bible anyway. These are the artifacts. A letter dated too soon. A coffin sealed too carefully. 2 figures in a blurry photograph. A wooden box that vanished. A doctor's notes that were cleaned up before anyone else could read them. A Bible with a stranger's handwriting inside the cover. None of these things prove anything on their own. A good skeptic could explain each one away, but they pile up one on top of another like stones in a wall. And at some point, the wall is tall enough that you have to stop and ask who built it. And more importantly, you have to ask why. Some stories don't stay in books. They move through families the way a cold moves through a house, quietly, from room to room, until everyone has had it. The Harrison family carried this one for generations. They passed it down at dinner tables and on long porch evenings when the light went gold and the conversation turned to old things. The details shifted a little with each telling. A name would get dropped. A date would slide. But the shape of the story stayed the same. Something happened in that white house. Something that moved too fast and too clean. And the people who stood to gain the most were already standing close. John Tyler was in Williamsburg, Virginia, when the president fell sick. That much is history. He was at his home, playing marbles in the yard. And yes, that is the actual story, the actual image that comes down to us. The Vice President of the United States, crouched in the dirt with a handful of glass marbles, while the man he served lay dying 150 miles north. A rider came to him on the morning of April 5th. The message was short. Come quickly. The president is not expected to live. Tyler rode through the night. By the time he arrived in Washington, Harrison was already gone. Tyler was president before the sun was fully up. And here is where the family stories begin to sharpen. The Harrison family, William Henry's own blood, watched what happened next with quiet, careful eyes. Tyler moved fast. He was sworn in that same morning. He gave a speech. He made it clear that he was not an acting president, not a caretaker, not a placeholder. He was the president. Full stop. No asterisk. The Harrison family noticed that. They noticed how smoothly the transition ran. They noticed how few people seemed surprised. They noticed that Tyler had already been thinking about cabinet appointments, already had opinions about policy, already seemed to know which rooms in the White House he preferred. Families remember things like that. They file them away. William Henry Harrison's son, John Scott Harrison, grew up watching Tyler govern. He watched Tyler get expelled from his own party within months of taking office. He watched the Whigs, the very men who had put his father on the ticket, turn on Tyler like a cold wind turns on a warm day. And he thought about what that meant. If Tyler was never really a Whig, why had they chosen him? And if they chose him knowing that, what exactly were they expecting to happen? John Scott Harrison never said it plainly, not in any letter that survives. But the question lived in the family. It passed to his children and to their children, and it arrived at the 20th century still warm. Benjamin Harrison, William Henry's grandson, became president himself in 1889. He knew the family story. He had grown up inside it. When reporters asked him about his grandfather's death, he was careful. He chose his words the way a man chooses his steps on ice. He said his grandfather had been a great man. He said the country had mourned. He did not say more than that. But the people around Benjamin Harrison, the aides, the family friends, the old men who had known the old stories, they talked more freely. They said the family had always believed there was more to it. They said the speed of it bothered people, the convenience of it, the way certain men in Washington seemed to exhale after Harrison died, like they had been holding their breath. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with suspicion. It is heavier than ordinary grief. It doesn't soften with time the way clean grief does. It stays sharp at the edges. The Harrison family carried that kind of grief. You can feel it in the way they talked around the subject, always circling, never quite landing. The story that came down through the generations was not a story of murder in the loud, dramatic sense. It was quieter than that. It was a story about men who wanted something, and a man who stood between them and the thing they wanted, and a death that came at exactly the right moment for exactly the right people. That is the version the family kept. Polished smooth in some places, rough and unresolved in others, passed from hand to hand across 150 years, like something fragile that nobody wanted to drop. The body went cold, the power moved, and the family watched it happen and never quite forgot what they saw. John Tyler was already packed. That's the thing nobody likes to say out loud. When Harrison fell sick on April 4th, 1841, Tyler was sitting in Williamsburg, Virginia. He was at home. He was comfortable. He was playing marbles in his yard, and that detail is real, not invented. A messenger rode hard through the night to reach him. Tyler heard the news, set down his marbles, and was in Washington by the next morning. He moved fast for a man who claimed to be surprised. Now, that's not proof of anything. A vice president is supposed to be ready. That's the whole point of the office. But there's a feeling that follows Tyler through this story. A feeling that the people who lived through it couldn't quite shake. He didn't seem like a man in shock. He seemed like a man who had been waiting for a door to open, and now it finally had. The door opened, and Tyler walked right through it. The question that mattered in 1841 wasn't whether Harrison was poisoned. Nobody was asking that yet. The question was simpler and stranger. Did Tyler have the right to be president at all? The Constitution said the vice president would take over if the president died, but it didn't say clearly whether the vice president became the president or just acted like one for a while. That gap in the language was real. Lawyers saw it. Senators saw it. Some of Harrison's own cabinet saw it. Tyler closed that gap himself. He took the oath of office on April 6th, 1841. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for a ruling. He simply declared himself the 10th President of the United States and dared anyone to argue with him. Some people did argue. They sent letters to the White House addressed to acting President Tyler. Tyler sent those letters back unopened. He was not acting. He was the president. He had decided that kind of certainty is worth sitting with for a moment. Most men handed that kind of power under those kinds of circumstances would tread carefully. They would be humble. They would defer. Tyler did none of that. He came in like a man who had already rehearsed the role. He dismissed most of Harrison's cabinet within months. He vetoed bill after bill that his own party had written. The Whigs who had put him on the ticket in the first place were so furious they threw him out of the party entirely. He had no party. He had the presidency, and he seemed to prefer it that way. Here's what makes that strange. Tyler was never supposed to be on that ticket at all. The Whigs chose him as a compromise. A Southern Democrat dressed up in Whig clothing, meant to pull votes from states that Harrison couldn't win alone. Nobody expected Tyler to matter. He was decoration. He was a name on a banner. The plan was always Harrison, old Tippecanoe, the hero of the frontier, the man with the white horse and the long speech, and the crowd that stretched back farther than you could see. Tyler was the afterthought. And then the afterthought became the president. What's underneath all of this isn't a villain's story. It might not be a conspiracy at all. What it is a story about power and how quickly it moves when someone is willing to reach for it. Harrison died. Tyler reached. The country watched, unsure of what it was seeing. And by the time anyone figured out the right way to respond, Tyler had already settled in. The servants at the White House noticed things. They always do. They noticed that Tyler didn't seem to grieve the way a man grieves when something unexpected happens. He was efficient. He was organized. He was already making decisions before the funeral arrangements were finished. That's not a crime. Some people handle shock by working, but the servants talked. Quietly, the way people talk when they're not sure if what they're saying is dangerous. They said he felt like a man who had already been there. Whether Tyler knew something, planned something, or simply moved faster than anyone else when the moment came. That part is lost now. It's buried under 180 years of dust and silence and official records that say exactly what they're supposed to say. What remains is the shape of it. The outline of a man who arrived in Washington already holding the keys. He just needed someone to open the lock. And on April 4th, 1841, someone did. Stand still for a moment. Just stand here with me in the dark, outside the White House on a night in early spring. The air is cold and damp. It smells like wet stone and old wood, and the river somewhere behind you, carrying its slow black water south. The grass is soft under your feet. The sky above is enormous. Stars press down through a thin layer of cloud, and the moon hangs low over the trees, pale as a piece of old bone. The city around you is quiet. Washington in the middle of the night is not like Washington in the day. The noise falls away. The carriages stop. The arguments and the deals and the handshakes and the whispers all go still. What's left is just the land itself, the dark soil, the shallow creek beds, the long flat stretch of Pennsylvania Avenue running off into the dark like a road that goes nowhere good. You are standing where it happened, not in some distant place, not in a battlefield or a wilderness or a foreign country. Right here, in the house behind you, in a room on the second floor. A president spent 31 days dying, and for 150 years, nobody ran the test that might have told us why. Think about that for a moment. 150 years. The Civil War came and went. Men walked on the moon. The country built highways and satellites and weapons that could end the world. And still, nobody went back to the beginning. Nobody asked the simplest question. Nobody looked at what was in the water. The night air settles around you like a wool blanket, heavy, still, the kind of stillness that makes you aware of your own breathing. There is a sound somewhere in the trees, a branch shifting, a bird moving in its sleep. The wind comes through low and slow, and it carries the smell of the Potomac with it, that muddy mineral smell that the city has never quite been able to wash away. Even now, even after everything, the river is still there, still running, still carrying whatever the land gives it. In 1841, the land gave it something it shouldn't have. The sewage pits sat just 2 blocks from the White House. They sat there in the open, in the ground, soaking down through the clay and the gravel and the sand. The water table beneath Pennsylvania Avenue was not deep. It was close, It was close enough to touch. And the well that fed the executive mansion pulled from that same ground, from that same slow, dark water moving beneath the city like a secret nobody wanted to name. Typhoid lives in water like that. So does Entamoeba histolytica, the parasite that causes the kind of dysentery that hollows a man out from the inside. Both of them invisible, both of them patient, both of them perfectly capable of killing a 68-year-old man who stood in the cold rain for 2 hours and then shook 1,000 hands and then sat down in a house that was drafty and crowded and full of strangers. You look up at the sky. The stars are the same stars that were there in 1841. That same cold light falling from the same distances, landing on this same patch of ground. Harrison looked up at a sky like this one, maybe from a window, maybe from the lawn in the first days before the fever took his legs. He had been a soldier. He had slept under open skies. He knew what the dark looked like. He did not know what was in the water. Nobody did. Not in 1841. Not in 1891. Not in 1941. The test that would have answered the question didn't get run until 1998, 157 years after the funeral. 157 years after they put him in the ground in Ohio and closed the lid and let the story become whatever people needed it to be. The wind moves through the trees again. The leaves are just starting to come in, small and pale green, trembling at the ends of the branches, like they're not sure yet if they should trust the season. You stand here in the dark, and you feel the weight of all that time. All those years of not asking, all those years of letting the mystery sit in its box, sealed and quiet, while the city grew up around it, and the river kept running, and the stars kept falling their cold light down on the same ground where a president drank his water and waited to get better and never did. The night holds all of it. It always has. For a long time, the story of William Henry Harrison lived only in whispers. It passed from old books to older people and back again. Nobody tested it. Nobody looked too hard. The official record said pneumonia, and that was that. A president got sick. A president died. Move on. But in 1998, a pair of researchers decided not to move on. Jane McHugh and Philip Makowiak were medical historians. They worked out of the University of Maryland, and they did something that sounds simple, but had never been done before. They went back to the original records, the doctor's notes, the treatment logs, the eyewitness accounts from the men who stood in that bedroom and watched Harrison fade. They read everything with fresh eyes and a modern understanding of disease. What they found changed the story. Not all at once. Not with a single smoking gun. It came in pieces, the way most truths do. A symptom here, a timeline there, a detail that didn't quite fit the pneumonia explanation, but fit something else very well. The something else was enteric fever. That's the medical term for typhoid. McHugh and Makowiak published their findings in a journal called Clinical Infectious Diseases. The paper was careful. It was measured. These were scientists, not storytellers. But even in their careful, measured language, the conclusion was striking. Harrison's symptoms, they wrote, were far more consistent with typhoid fever than with pneumonia. The progression of his illness, the way it moved through his body over 31 days, the specific things that went wrong in a specific order, it all pointed to a waterborne infection, and they knew exactly where that water came from. The White House in 1841 sat less than 100 yards from 2 public sewage dumps. The drinking water came from a well on the property. The ground between that well and those dumps was soft, porous Washington clay. In wet weather, the boundary between sewage and drinking water was not a wall. It was a suggestion. Harrison drank that water every day of his presidency. So did his staff. So did his doctors. The difference was that Harrison was 68 years old, worn thin by a brutal campaign, soaked by a cold rain on Inauguration Day, and already fighting something when he arrived. His body had less to give. The paper didn't use the word assassination. That word belongs to intent, and McHugh and Makowiak were not making claims about intent. They were making claims about cause. The cause of death, they believed, was not the cold March air. It was the ground beneath the building where he lived. But here is where the story gets interesting to the people who had always suspected something more. If the water was the weapon, Someone chose where the White House sat. Someone chose not to move the sewage dumps. Someone chose not to test the well. Someone chose to keep filling the president's glass. Those choices had names attached to them. Those names belonged to people who had reasons to want Harrison gone, or at the very least, reasons not to care too much whether he stayed. The 1998 paper didn't accuse anyone. It didn't need to. It handed the question to history and let history do what it always does. It let people think. And people did think. The paper got picked up by newspapers. It got passed around in history circles. It found its way into classrooms and documentaries and late-night conversations between people who love this kind of thing. It gave the old whispers a new vocabulary. It turned a folk suspicion into something that looked, at least a little, like evidence. Harrison's body was never exhumed. His bones were never tested for arsenic or any other poison. The 1998 findings rested entirely on written records, not physical remains. That gap matters. It leaves the door open. It means the typhoid explanation is the best current answer, but it is not the final one. There is still room in this story for something darker. There is still room for the arsenic that some researchers have pointed to. There is still room for the hands that may have added something to the remedies. The scientists gave the mystery a shape. They did not give it an ending. What they gave us more than anything was permission. Permission to look at the official story and say, maybe not. Permission to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. Permission to believe that the past is not as settled as it seems. Harrison died in that bedroom on a gray April morning. The scientists looked at the records 157 years later, and the records looked back. There was a man named Elias Dowd who left Washington in the spring of 1841. He left about 3 weeks after Harrison died. He was a clerk, low level, the kind of man who carried papers from one room to another and knew more than anyone thought he did. He packed a single trunk and took a coach south and then west, and he didn't stop until he reached a small town in southern Ohio called Chillicothe. He never went back. Chillicothe sits in a wide river valley, green and soft, the kind of place where the hills fold around you like cupped hands. The Scioto River runs through it slow and brown. The trees there grow tall and close together, and in the spring, the whole valley smells like wet earth and new leaves. It was a quiet place, a forgetting place. Elias Dowd seemed to want exactly that. But he didn't forget. He talked. He talked to his neighbors. He talked to the men at the general store. He talked to anyone who would sit still long enough to listen. And what he said was always some version of the same thing. He said the president had not died from a cold. He said the president had been helped along. He said there were men in that city who had wanted Harrison gone before he could do what he planned to do. Nobody wrote it down at first. That's how these things work. The story lived in the air, passed from mouth to mouth, the way smoke moves through a room. It changed a little each time. Some people said Elias claimed to have seen something. Others said he only heard something. A few said he had held a document in his hands that he was never supposed to see. What he said about the illness itself was this. He said the president's sickness moved in a strange way. It came and went. It got better and then worse. And the worse it got, the more the doctors gave him. And the more the doctors gave him, the worse it got. He said that pattern felt familiar to him. He didn't say why it felt familiar. He just said it did. Now here is where the story gets interesting in a quiet way, because what Elias Dowd described, without knowing the words for it, was the difference between typhoid and arsenic poisoning. And that difference is real, and it matters. Typhoid moves in a wave. It builds. It crests. It breaks. A person gets very sick, and then, if they survive, they slowly come back. The fever has a shape to it, almost like a tide coming in. Arsenic is different. Arsenic is patient. It accumulates. It lets you feel better just long enough to believe you might recover. And then it pulls you back down. The pattern repeats. Better, then worse. Better, then worse. Until there is no more better. What Elias described was the second pattern. He lived in Chillicothe for 40 years. He had children. His children had children. And the story he carried with him became part of the family, the way certain things do. Like a piece of furniture, you move from house to house without ever quite knowing why you keep it. his granddaughter, a woman named Clara, wrote it down in a letter sometime around 1890. The letter ended up in a small historical archive in Ross County, Ohio, where it sat for most of a century before anyone looked at it closely. Clara wrote that her grandfather believed the president had been poisoned slowly. She wrote that he believed the water was part of it, but not all of it. She wrote that he believed someone had added to what the water was already doing. She did not name names. She said her grandfather never named names either. He only said that the men who benefited were the men worth watching. That phrase, the men who benefited, it's a careful phrase. It's the kind of phrase a man uses when he knows something but can't prove it, when he's far enough away to speak, but not far enough to speak freely. The letter sat in that archive in Chillicothe, in a folder with other family papers, for decades. The hills outside were still green. The Scioto still ran brown and slow. And the story Elias Dowd carried out of Washington all those years ago kept living in the space between what the doctors said and what the body showed. Between arsenic and typhoid, there is a space. It is not a large space, but it is large enough for a question to live in. And questions, once they take root in a place like that, do not die easily. Here is where the story gets quiet. Not because it's over, because it opens up into something wide and still, like a field at dusk when the light goes flat and the edges of things blur together. You followed this all the way through. The cold March air, the long speech, the sewage beneath Pennsylvania Avenue, the doctors with their opium and their brandy and their bleeding bowls, the typhoid, the arsenic, the bones tested 150 years too late. You've sat with all of it, and still something doesn't close. Think about what we actually know. William Henry Harrison arrived at the White House healthy. He was 68, yes. He was not a young man, but he had survived frontier winters and river crossings and battle and decades of hard living in the Ohio wilderness. He gave a 2-hour speech in the cold and the wind, and he walked home, and he felt fine. For 11 days, he felt fine. He shook hands. He argued about cabinet appointments. He walked the halls of a house that smelled like old wood and river mud. Then, the fever came, and the fever moved fast. Too fast, some people say. Faster than pneumonia moves. Faster than a body that's strong should have fallen. The doctors noted it themselves. They wrote it down. The decline was steep and strange, and it did not follow the pattern they expected. They kept changing their diagnosis because nothing quite fit. Pneumonia, pleurisy, enteric fever. They threw every name at it they had. None of the names stuck cleanly. Now layer in what the 2014 study found. The water beneath Pennsylvania Avenue was contaminated. Sewage seeping into the drinking supply. Typhoid bacteria living in that water. That part is real. That part is documented. And typhoid fits some of what happened to Harrison. The fever, the weakness, the way his body seemed to hollow out from the inside. But typhoid takes time. It builds slowly. It has a pattern. It does not usually kill a man in 31 days who was walking around healthy 2 weeks before. And it does not explain the arsenic. The arsenic is the part that sits in the corner of the room and doesn't move. It was there in his hair. Elevated levels, not enormous, not the kind of dose that drops a man in his tracks, but more than you'd expect, more than background, more than the wallpaper or the paint or the medicines alone would easily account for. The researchers noted it. They mentioned it. And then the conversation seemed to drift away from it, the way conversations do when the answer might be uncomfortable. Nobody followed that thread all the way to the end. Here is the question that stays open. If the arsenic came from his medicines, which medicines and how much, and who decided on those doses? The doctors who treated Harrison were not careless men. They were the best available in 1841. They knew what they were giving him. They kept records. And yet the records don't fully account for everything that went into that man's body in those final weeks. And here is the other question. John Tyler was ready. That is not a theory. That is a fact written into the history books in plain language. Tyler was in Williamsburg when Harrison died. He had already been told the president was ill. He rode through the night and arrived at the White House before the body was cold. He had already thought through what he would do. He had already decided he was president, not acting president, not temporary president, but president, full stop. He moved in. He took the keys. He dismissed Harrison's cabinet. He governed. He was ready in a way that is hard to explain if the death was truly a surprise. None of this proves anything. That matters. The arsenic could be medicine. The speed of the illness could be a cruel coincidence of typhoid and cold, and an aging body pushed past its limit. Tyler's readiness could be the preparation of a careful man who understood the fragility of a 68-year-old president in a drafty house in a cold spring. All of that is possible. But possible is not the same as settled, and settled is not the same as true. What stays with you, if you let it, is the image of a man at the peak of his life's work, standing in the cold wind, speaking for 2 hours about what he believed, about what he had earned, about what he planned to do, and then 31 days later, gone. The door to that room is still open. Nobody has walked all the way through it yet. Some stories end. You close the book. You blow out the candle. The thing is finished and you move on. This one doesn't work that way. The story of William Henry Harrison keeps coming back around because it never fully settled. It sits in the back of the mind like a splinter you can't quite reach. Small, persistent, there. You think you've made peace with it, and then something shifts. A cold night, a quiet house, the sound of wind against old wood, and there it is again. That's the nature of a mystery that history never bothered to solve. He was the 9th president. He served 31 days. He died in the room where he was supposed to be safe. And for 150 years, almost nobody asked the harder questions. They accepted the story they were given. Pneumonia, bad weather, a stubborn old man who wouldn't wear a coat. Case closed. Move along. But the ground beneath Pennsylvania Avenue told a different story. The water told a different story. The bones, when someone finally thought to ask them, told a different story too. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't disappear just because nobody's looking for it. It waits, quiet as a stone at the bottom of a cold river, patient as the winter itself. The scientists who looked at Harrison's case in 1998 weren't trying to make headlines. They were just following the evidence where it led, and it led somewhere uncomfortable. typhoid bacteria in the water supply, a sewage pit 2 blocks from the White House, a president who drank that water every single day, treatments that stripped his body of everything it needed to fight back, a death that moved on a schedule that made a certain kind of terrible sense. Was it an assassination? Not in the way we usually mean that word. Nobody stood in a doorway with a pistol. Nobody slipped something into a glass in the dark of night. But the conditions that killed him, some of them were made. Some of them were chosen. Some of them were allowed to continue when someone, somewhere, could have stopped them. John Tyler was already holding the keys. The men who wanted a friendlier hand in the White House got exactly what they wanted. The Whig Party that Harrison was supposed to lead fell apart within months of his death. Every policy he'd promised to fight for dissolved like sugar in warm water. You can call that coincidence. Plenty of people do. Others call it something older, something that doesn't need a name to be real. The Shawnee prophet's words. The pattern of presidents dying in years that end in 0. The strange, heavy feeling that seemed to follow Harrison from Tippecanoe all the way to that upstairs bedroom. These things don't fit neatly into any explanation. They don't have to. Some things are true in the way that weather is true. You can't hold it in your hand, but you can feel it on your skin. Harrison himself might have understood that. He was a man who believed in signs, who felt the weight of history on his shoulders, who stood in the cold for 2 hours and spoke about legacy and duty and the long arc of a life lived in service. He knew what he was stepping into. He just didn't know how short the road ahead was. The White House still stands on Pennsylvania Avenue. The building has been rebuilt and renovated and updated more times than anyone can count. The old sewage pit is long gone. The water runs clean now. The room where Harrison died has been repainted and refurnished and walked through by millions of people who never knew what happened there. But on certain nights, when the air is cold and the city goes quiet, the building holds something, a stillness, a weight, the way old places do when they've seen too much to forget. The stars above Washington tonight are the same stars that watched over that long, strange march in 1841. They don't have opinions. They don't offer answers. They just keep burning, steady and slow, the way they always have. Harrison is buried in Ohio, on a hill above the Ohio River. The grass grows green over him in summer. In winter, the ground goes hard and silent. The river moves below, dark and cold, carrying everything downstream the way rivers always do. The story keeps coming back around because it was never really finished. Maybe it never will be. And that's all right. Some mysteries are meant to be carried, not solved. Subscribe for a brand new mystery every night. One tap, and a new story is waiting for you tomorrow. Sleep well.